We sang that song, Trusting Jesus, and it said, "Till within the jasper wall." And you may not know what that is, right? So if you're not sure what that meant, the jasper wall, the Bible talks in the book of Revelation about the New Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven from God, and that New Jerusalem has a certain way that God has it built. And a part of the building is there are certain stones and certain jewels and emeralds that adorn it and are part of its construction. And so jasper is one of those. And anyway, it's interesting if you've ever gone through and looked through the songbook, some of the things that we sing, and just see a lot of the songs that we sing, especially the older ones, it took some very deep and thoughtful contemplation to write what they wrote. And not everybody's that way, but some of them, it was a lot of reading and meditating in the Old Testament and some truths about Christ that come out of the Old Testament. So anyway, it's great to sing about. We're in the book of Ruth tonight, Ruth chapter 2, as we continue on. I think, guys, did you have enough for everybody? All right, if you need a copy of this, would you just raise up your hand? We forgot to tell you it's $5 a copy, okay? So it's just going to be a running price. All right, so it looks like everybody's got a copy of that. So we're in Ruth chapter 2. All right, so just by way of a very brief overview, this is in the days when the judges are ruling. And so, of course, that places us where we are in Israel's history during the time of the judges. This is more toward the end of the time of the judges, just before we get through that and we get into the birth of Samuel and then the life of Samuel and moving on into David. So Ruth is the bridge between the judges and King David. Ruth is the bridge, and we would not have known the lineage of David the king. It would have had no significance to us had it not been for Ruth. And so there's a lot of history in this book, but there's a lot of principles that are here as well. So we have a famine that starts us out, and a famine in the house of bread. Bethlehem means the house of bread. And so the place where there's supposed to be bread is now a famine. Of course, we know why the famine was there. The famine was there because of Israel's rebellion against God. And for several hundred years of their history now in the land, they had done nothing but cycle through idolatry and rebellion. And so as a result of that, they would not listen to what God had said. They disobeyed the law that God had laid down for them as a nation. And so God sent his judgment into the land. And so God typically would do that in the Old Testament. He would send famine. They were a society that obviously, much like we are in the world today, but they were held up by their daily bread, the things that they got out of the fields that day. And so God would send something he would shut the water off or dry up the land or things of that nature, sometimes pestilence and sometimes plagues of locusts or certain things like that. He would increase the beasts of the field, all in an attempt to get the attention of his people. And so this was happening regularly through the book of Judges and actually through Israel's history as well. And so what we have now is we have this sort of intermission that God tells us this wonderful little love story and encourages us because in the midst of all of the idolatry and God's judgment in the nation, we have this one little pocket of Bethlehem, out of which would come a greater love story, the birth of Christ. But at this time, this wonderful little story that shows there's godliness, there's integrity, there are all the good things that God intended for his people, that they're still in play even in the midst of a society that had gone so bad. And it's an encouragement to us today that even in a world that has gone so far away from what God had intended, there are still places in this world where there are people who love the Lord. There are people that are functioning as God intended for them to function. And there are still lights in dark places. And it just encourages us that not all is bad, even though a lot is bad. And so we have this story that shows up. If we have some main characters, of course, we have Elimelech here. My God is king. That's what his name means. But in the time of famine, Elimelech runs to the enemy, which is Moab. And he drags his wife Naomi and their two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, with them. And they leave the house of bread and they go into the land of Moab. And Moab, of course, was birthed from an incestuous relationship and has been the enemy of Israel since really their founding, them coming into the land. And so Elimelech dies, and then the two boys marry, and they marry two Moabite women, right? So the name of the first is the name of our book, right? Ruth. and her sister-in-law, Orpah. And we were encouraging you not to think of Oprah, because they were two separate people at two separate times. And so the boys also died, and now Naomi is left, and she's a widow, and now she has no sons, no family. And so she's very much poverty-stricken and doesn't know what to do. And at that time, she hears that now the famine is over in Bethlehem, and God had given his people bread. So in other words, God had turned the rain back on. The crops were now being harvested. And so she decides, well, I don't have anything else here. I'm going to head back to the home country. It's been at least 10 years since we've been there, and let's just see what happens. And so that's the story of chapter number 1. And of course, we know this wonderful story, how Ruth essentially said to her mother-in-law, I'm not going to leave you, and I want to come with you. So that takes us now to chapter number 2, where they've just now showed up, and the whole town is stirred up about the fact that Naomi is back. Chapter 2, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light on the part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. And then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, it is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. And then said Boaz unto Ruth, hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. And then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldst take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? And Boaz answered and said to her, it hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. All right, so let's just leave it there. We might get that far optimistically, but it's doubtful. So let's just pick it up now and talk a little bit about some things in this chapter. So, of course, we know that the story began here with a crisis at home. And with the famine, it led to Naomi's distress in a foreign land. And now with the death of her husband, her two sons, she gets this hopeless return back to Bethlehem with her daughter-in-law. And so what we see now in this story is we see the hand of God. And everything about chapter 2 is providence. We're going to talk about providence here in a minute. But what we see is we see the hand of God as the story unfolds here. What Naomi saw was defeat. When she was in Moab, Naomi saw defeat. What Ruth saw in chapter 2 was Ruth saw a field. What Boaz saw, which we'll look at, is Boaz saw Ruth, and what he saw in Ruth was virtue. But what God saw in all of this was redemption. So what you have is you have a story unfolding in this life, and the players in the story, if you want to permit a crude way of looking at it, it's like a play, but God is not a cruel master that's dangling all of his playthings down here for his amusement. That's not how God is. So don't view it that way when I use the illustration here. But the players in this play are living their lives out, and they don't recognize in the moment that God is actually in control of it. And God has a wonderful purpose in this story that's going to lead to Jesus Christ, and none of these people know that that's going to take place. And so what you see is you see the unseen hand of God. And there's a great moral lesson in that for you and I as believers, that in our lives, we understand that we are bought with a price. We understand that we're part of God's family. We understand sovereignty, and we understand God's purposes being played out in his own children. So when we understand that, then we must also accept the truth of what Ruth didn't understand in the moment, that God is working things out in our lives for his purposes. And so the distress, the sorrow, the death, the sickness that led to the death, the poverty, the uncertainty, the transition from one country to another, all of these things that are played out in Ruth's life and in Naomi's life, God is the one that was in charge of that, and he was orchestrating all of that for a great purpose. So it's the unseen hand of God, and it's good for us to remember that in our life. We're going through something, a trial, an uncertainty, whatever it might be, but don't miss the fact that God is working things out. So I want to talk with you, first of all, in your notes, the accidental providence of God. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but the accidental providence of God. I think that's a blank you have in your notes. The accidental providence of God. So what Naomi needed to see is that God had not forsaken her. God had not forsaken her. What does she think when she's in Moab? All she's looking at it as the distress of the last 10 years. I've lost my husband, and now both of my sons are dead. I have nothing. And again, in that society and culture, there's no government program for widows. There's no financial assistance that's available to you. You either find a way or you die. And so here she is in the land of the enemy, and she's made a life, if you will, for 10 years, but she has nothing. She has nothing. And so what she is feeling like at this point is, God has forsaken me. Remember what she said to Ruth and Orpah? It grieves me that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. God has forsaken me. So Naomi needed to see God had not forsaken her. And of course, we know at the very beginning of the story, as we looked at, that what Naomi did was influence Ruth toward Jehovah God. Ruth didn't know who Jehovah God was. She was an idolatress, right? But what Naomi did in the early days is she influenced Ruth toward God. And now what we see is going to happen here is Ruth is going to influence Naomi back to God. And Naomi's now going to find her joy. She's going to reconnect, if you will, with who God is and God's purposes in her own life. And God is going to use Ruth to do that. So it's an interesting twist. At the very start, Ruth needed Naomi to find God. At the end of the story, what we see is Naomi needed Ruth to see God again. Okay? But secondly, in your notes, Ruth needed to see God would provide for her. So here we have a young lady, and she had been married, but now has been a widow herself for a period of time. And she's young, presumably, right? She's fairly young. And so she's looking at the hopelessness of her situation. She knows coming into the Hebrew culture, she is an enemy nation to the Hebrews. There's no way any of these guys are going to make an advance toward her. The odds of her ever marrying and bearing children and having a family and the comfort and security that comes with that for a woman, that's probably never going to be a reality from a human perspective. And so she looks at this, and she needs to know now God is going to provide. Now, her journey started with the death of a husband when we look at Ruth. She's introduced onto the scene, but the journey really with her started with the death of a husband. When we get to the end of her story, it's going to end with the birth of a son. Right? So what does that show you? That shows you God providentially working in a marvelous way in her life. So I want you to notice now, when I had you fill in that first blank, the accidental providence of God, we understand there's no accidents with God. But in the story, if you're looking at verse 3, we're in chapter 2 and verse number 3, she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And notice it says, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. What is that indicating? It's almost like it was an accidental, unforeseen, didn't see that coming, I just happened to accidentally wind up in this field. I could have been on this side of the road in this field, but I just happened to be on this side of the road in this field. But what was it? It was God's providence that she went into that field. So the principle for us is there's no accidents with God. Okay? It's providence is what it is. Now, she was looking for a field. In the Old Testament culture, it was built into the Old Testament law, designed by God. It was built into the Old Testament law that if the poor of the land did not have food, that at the time of the harvest, the poor of the land could come in, and God said that whatever the reapers got in the first run through the field, they couldn't go back and pick up at a second run. So whatever was left from the reaping, there's always bits and pieces that were left. It would have been the corners of the field, or maybe this little patch just never got looked over and they moved on. They couldn't go back and revisit all that and clean everything out. God said that was for the poor of the land to come in. and they would have an opportunity to glean a little bit, and so it was God's way of providing for the poor. And so Ruth said to Naomi here, I need to go out and see if I can find us some food. And so she went out to a field, and she knew that she was going to work, but she understood that she was going to glean after the reapers were there. She was looking for a field. Now, notice it was talking about the corn here. And there's corn that it says in verse number 2, to glean the ears of the corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. So the corn of the Bible is not the corn of today, okay? Now, one of the great foods of today is corn on the cob. Do you like corn on the cob? Extra butter, extra salt. Extra hot, okay. So, but the corn of today is very different. So the corn of the Bible, when you look at the corn, it's a kernel of grain, right? So when Jesus was giving a spiritual principle in John in chapter 12, he says, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. The corn of wheat. So you might be thinking corn on the cob, but corn in the New Testament, corn in the Bible, is basically speaking about grain that could be in a head. So it could be any sort of a grain. It could be wheat, could be barley, could be rye, whatever. That's the corn. So she's going to go out to this field, and she's going to try to get the corn or the grain that's there. So at the beginning of the story, if you're looking, go back in chapter 1, verse number 22. I guess you're probably just in the same page. But notice it says at the end of it that they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. So at the beginning of our story here, it was at the beginning of barley harvest. But it lasted, if you're in chapter 2, and you drop down to verse number 23, the last verse in that chapter. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of barley harvest and of wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. So the barley and the wheat harvest were at two separate times, one after the other. So there was a span of between 3 and 4 months from the time that the barley harvest started until the end of wheat harvest. Two different harvests, but barley was harvested first in the northern hemisphere. So you have this story unfolding in a span of 3 to 4 months. So if you're looking at the history of this and just kind of thinking through the story, this story lasts for about a 3 or 4 month period of time during the harvest time, okay? So just an interesting thing to note. Sometimes when we read a story in the Bible, we don't understand the time frame. And it's good for us to know the time frame that takes place here. So true love, you can find true love in 3 to 4 months. Okay, that's the moral of the story. So Ruth happened upon the field of Boaz. And interestingly enough, Boaz just happened to visit that field today in our story. So in chapter 2, verse number 3, her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz. And notice verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. Just so happened that the master of the field, who was, by the way, a landowner and probably had multiple fields, but he just happened to come to this place, to this field, at this time, when Ruth just happened to be there at that time. He comes from his home in Bethlehem out to the fields. And if you were to look at Bethlehem topographically, here's what you would see. Bethlehem lies on the top of a hill. It's very close to Jerusalem, just to the south, but it's up. So Bethlehem lies up. And so all of the fields and then the threshing of those fields are all done down. Now, typically what would happen in those days is that when the grain was harvested and it needed to be beaten out, they would do the winnowing or the beating out of that up on a hillside so the wind would take the chaff and blow it out. So they would do the winnowing where it had the wind to catch it. So typically that was done up on a hillside. But Bethlehem was just the reverse because topographically it sits up on the top of the hill. And so all of the fields and then the winnowing were actually down below the city, which we'll see later in the chapter bears out the inspiration of this book. It proves that factually this book has to be right because, as you know, there are the critics of the Bible who are always trying to find a way to undermine the truth and say this is just a story, it didn't really happen, it's just a great love story, but it's fiction, okay? And find out just little things like this, that's not true. So Bethlehem lies up on top, and Boaz's home was in Bethlehem like everybody else, and so he comes down now to the field to see how the harvest was getting along. And this divine appointment, I think in your notes you have a blank there, a divine appointment in verse number 3, her hap. Okay, this is a divine appointment. So the words divine appointment are not are not new words, and they're not original with me, but it's just a wonderful truth that God divinely appointed this meeting at this particular time. You know what this is? This is Romans 8:28 in action. Okay, now what does that say? And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. So what God is doing, as he's always done with his people, is he's enacting his purposes amongst his people. And that's what that is taking place here. It's God steering the life of an unsuspecting woman to fulfill his purposes in her life. So she just happened, but that just happened to be God. Okay? So let me just give you some thoughts on the providence of God. Some thoughts on the providence of God. There's no big or small with God. There's no such thing as big or small. He cares about every detail of your life. When we think about providence, what we're looking is the superintending presence of God over your life. But what we have this mentality about in our lives is this, that we think that God is like us, that God thinks like us. Now, we wouldn't say that, but we actually feel that way. So, therefore, we feel like I can't bother God with the little things of my life because he's unconcerned with the little things in my life. I'm just going to bring God the big rocks in my life. And these are the things that God cares about, but the little tiny things that are my personalities or my preferences or my wants that don't really matter in the whole scope of things, I'm not going to bother God with those. But God tells us often in scriptures in various ways that he is concerned with the little things of our life, and he takes notice of all the things of our life. So let me tell you what Jesus said in Luke in chapter 12. As an illustration, Luke 12, verse 6 and 7, he said, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 farthings, and not one of them is forgotten before God? But even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows." Now, there's a number of ways in the New Testament where Jesus bore this out. He gave an illustration similar to this at other times. But God is saying here, I care about the little things of your life. I'm aware of the little things. There is no big or small. There's your life, and I care about your life. So the Lord is looking at your life tonight, and in his providence, he will superintend over your life because he cares about every part of your life. Now, let me just say this. It doesn't mean he agrees with every part of our life. Right? We know that there are the secret corners of our lives and our hearts maybe that are not in fellowship with the Lord, or there might be secret sin, or there might be sinful motives or wrong intentions. Okay, it's not that God agrees with everything in my life, but God cares about everything in my life. And there's nothing about our life that's small in the sight of God. You know what providence is? Providence is God working in you. That's what it is. The providence of God is God working in you. In Philippians 2, what does Paul say? For it is God which worketh in us both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Proverbs 2 and verse 13. God works in us to give us the want to fulfill his will. Okay, that's providence. Providence is God at work in your life and steering your life, directing your life, because he has great purposes for your life. And when we resist the working of God in our life, ultimately what we're doing is we're resisting the providence of God. God is wanting to provide, to superintend because of his goodness in our life. He's wanting to do that for us, for our benefit and for our good. But when we resist the will of God, we're resisting his providence at work, because providence is God working in me. So when we think about our lives and decisions, and oftentimes we are concerned with the providence of God because of the fact that we have a decision that's looming. Life is a constant series of decisions, some big and some small, but all important in our life. And so when we're faced with a decision in our life, there's a human part of us, and what we do is we get alone and we pray, we seek the wisdom of God, we seek the direction of God to make our decisions, and then what do? We decide. So our study tonight is not a course in how we make right decisions, but simply stating the fact that this is what we do. We have a decision we have to make, and we go through whatever process we go through, and then we ultimately make a decision. And sometimes we make decisions that are what we consider to be, quote, bad decisions. Have you ever made one of those? Hey, listen, have you ever made a decision you thought was right, only later to look back at it and go, maybe it wasn't right? Now, how is it that we determine that in our life? It's hindsight, but I think there's something deeper than that, what I'm trying to drive at. We tend to make a decision, and then if something happens as a consequence of that decision that we would consider to be bad in some way, there's a loss in some way, then we say, I must have made the wrong decision, right? Because the result of that decision is in some way objectively bad or worse than what I had before. But that's not actually factually correct. Because there are times where God gives us his direction and it leads us to a season that is an uncomfortable season, but God has a purpose in that to lead us somewhere else. So we can't just view the result of our immediate decision and say, it must have been a bad decision. But there are times that we think, okay, it must have been a bad decision because we made a mistake or something in some way. But listen, when we go through things like that, we need to understand that the decisions that we make as we're pursuing the will of God, the decisions that we make, God's providence is still at work. God is working in us through it all. That's what Romans 8:28 is all about. The promise that we have in that verse is that, okay, if you believe that you're making a right decision, and so you decide to do this, but you don't feel objectively like you're better off because of that decision, or maybe it brought some conflict or some discomfort with it, God is saying, in my providence, I am superintending over your life. I'm still working in you, even though in the moment it doesn't feel like it. And that's a great comfort, or it should be. Because there's not a one of us, not one, that will ever make always right decisions, good decisions, wise decisions at every course of our life. It doesn't happen. We're human beings. It doesn't excuse sin and wrong, but it is reality for all of us. And God's providence is still at work. I said when we were talking about providence that there are no accidents with God. So in this situation with Ruth, when we see what's happening, we can clearly see there was no accident with God. Okay, the fact that her husband Mahlon died, that's a horrible thing. But had he not died, she would not have ended up where she ended up, and David would not have been born through that line, right? And so there are no accidents when we think about this with God. It's all under his direction. It's all under God's control. So everything is used for God's purposes. God uses the wickedness of this world for his purposes. God used unsaved pagan kings and called them my servants because they were fulfilling his purposes. God uses everything for his purposes. We know Romans 8:28, but verse 29, in the context of that, verse 29 says this, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. So what God was saying is, I'm going to work it together for good because I have predetermined that the circumstances of your life are going to make you more like Jesus. So the difficult situations of your life that you wonder, is God even really here? You've got to take a step back from your emotion, take a step back from your feeling, look at what God said and go, oh, he is here, it hurts. He is here, I'm afraid. He is here, I don't know what to do, but here's what I do know. Through all of this, he wants me to be more like him. So he's using this to make me more like Christ. Okay, that's a New Testament concept, but it's a wonderful concept. So every detail of your life, even things you consider to be random, unexpected, things outside of your control, everything you've had to endure or to go through in your life, many of which you had no choice in. There are things that happen, not as a result of choices you made, but they just happened. And you got caught up in it. It could be a health crisis, it could be a financial crisis, a relational crisis, a job crisis, whatever. Okay, you may not have had any choice, but you got caught up in that. All of that is being used by the Lord to shape you to be more like him. That's God's providence. He's working in you, and that's the entire narrative of the Bible. Okay, if you go through from start to finish in the Bible, what you find is that story, the everyday, the non-miraculous events of people's lives that fulfilled God's purposes. That's what God is doing. So the providence of God is a wonderful thing, and it's of course the providence of God that's seen when Ruth shows up in the field that day. God working in a way that only God can work to bring something to pass, God's providence. If you go back to Ruth in chapter 2, or you might just still be there, I want you to notice in verse number 2 what it says. Ruth said to Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. You know what Ruth was looking for is Ruth was looking for grace. What is grace? It's undeserved favor. Ruth knew as a Moabitess woman that she was stepping into the field of a Hebrew, a God-fearing Hebrew, who would not know her. She's not a part of the family, that like the Jewish family, the Hebrew family. She's not a part of that family. She's not a part of the worship of God. Like the city would not know her yet. And she needs undeserved favor. If somebody doesn't show grace to me, like favor me even though I'm a Moabite, if they don't do that, we're going to die. So Ruth was looking for grace. If you drop down to verse number 10, she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground. And she said to Boaz, why have I found grace in thine eyes? Drop down to verse number 13. Then she said, let me find favor in thy sight. There it is again. Undeserved favor. Ruth was looking for grace. Okay, what was she? She was a widow. She was a woman. She was an alien, a stranger. Like this is, in these days, this is 3 strikes against you. Because she had no skill or ability in and of herself. She was not a landowner. She was a woman. And the women of these days, they married and they bore children and they guided the home. They nurtured the family. They were a massive, if not the biggest part of Hebrew culture was a God-fearing woman. But she didn't have that. She had no husband. She had no means. She had nothing. This is her story. Think about it this way. Life was stacked against Ruth. From a human perspective, everything was stacked against her. She knew she had no right to expect kindness of a stranger. She didn't know who Boaz was. She could have had a lineup, and she wouldn't have been able to pick Boaz out of the crowd. She'd never seen him before. Didn't know who he was. So this is that undeserved favor, this thing that she was looking for. And listen, we talk about Ruth as a type or a picture of something, right? And this story here pictures today the Gentiles as strangers that are seeking grace and favor from the Lord. Paul talked about this in a New Testament perspective in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse number 12. He says that at that time, talking about before you got saved, that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. And what did we need? Grace, the grace of God. In that very passage in Ephesians 2, you would know this, right? For by grace are you saved, through faith. What did we need? As Gentiles, we were coming to the field, if you will, looking for grace, undeserved favor. We had no right to enter the field. There was nothing we could do. We needed grace, and Ruth was looking for grace, and Boaz extended grace to her. We're going to have to leave our story there. We're just getting started, I know, but we're going to continue, but it's already 7:45, and we need to pray. So why don't we leave it here? Now, when we come back next week, we're going to pick the story up right here, but next week, I'm going to teach you on the character of a godly woman, because now we're going to really focus in on who Ruth was and the things about Ruth's life that caught the attention of God and God brings out here. So we're going to look at the character of a godly woman, looking at Ruth, and then we're going to look at the Christ-likeness of a godly man when we get to the story of Boaz. And I don't know if we're going to be able to cover that next week, but that might be the week after. So don't go anywhere. We're going to continue on with the story next week. Our Father, thank you for your word today and just the wonderful principles that are here, so very practical. We would just want to thank you, Lord, for your providence in our life. The fact that you look over every event of the course of our life, and there's no matter that's too small, nothing that you're unconcerned with. It all matters to you. And we know that as we submit to your purposes in our life, that you will work out something far more grand in the story of our life than we could have ever understood. So, Lord, I pray this would be a great faith-building lesson for all of us, that we would continue to trust in you as we look at the story of Ruth. And we pray it in Jesus' name.